The North Atlantic was a graveyard in 1942. Gale-force winds lashed the waves into towering black walls, and icy spray froze onto steel decks. Somewhere in that chaos steamed the SS Stephen Hopkins, a Liberty ship on her maiden voyage. She was squat, slow, and awkwardly built. No match, it seemed, for the warships that prowled these waters. German officers sneered at such vessels, calling them cheap rust buckets, unworthy of the oceans they crossed. Yet on September 27, 1942, fate placed the Stephen Hopkins against the German commerce raider Stier and its tender Tannenfels. Outgunned and out-armored, the Liberty ship might have been expected to surrender without a fight. Instead, her crew, a mixture of Navy gunners and merchant sailors, chose defiance. Her single 4-inch deck gun roared to life. Shells slammed into the German vessel even as the Hopkins was raked with fire. Flames licked skyward, lifeboats splintered, and smoke boiled over the stormy sea. When the battle ended, the Stephen Hopkins was sinking, her decks shattered and many of her crew dead. But beside her drifted the burning wreck of the Stier, scuttled after mortal wounds inflicted by the very ship German officers had laughed at. It was the first time an armed merchant vessel had destroyed a German raider. A sailor later recalled the stunned silence among survivors in the lifeboats. We had gone down, but we had taken the enemy with us. This moment symbolized a bitter irony. The Liberty ships, mocked as fragile and temporary, were proving their worth in the harshest crucible imaginable. Each was designed to be built quickly and cheaply, not to win duels at sea. They were workhorses, not warships. Yet here was one that had bloodied the pride of the Kriegsmarine. To the Allies, the Liberty ship represented something far greater than steel and rivets. It was a statement of industrial defiance, proof that America could harness its factories to flood the oceans with ships faster than the enemy could sink them. They were not elegant like ocean liners or mighty like battleships. They were blunt instruments of survival. For Germany, this battle foreshadowed a grim future. Their officers had underestimated the power of mass production. They had scoffed at the ungainly silhouettes rolling off American shipways, believing them to be temporary patches in a collapsing supply system. Instead, these so-called ugly ducklings would carry tanks to North Africa, fuel to Britain, and men and munitions to every front of the global war. The fight of the Stephen Hopkins against the Stier was but one episode, but it encapsulated the larger story. The contest between speed of construction and speed of destruction, between the relentless waves of industry and the sharp claws of German U-boats and raiders. As the lifeboats drifted on the storm-churned sea that day, survivors watched the horizon swallow both victor and victim. Their ship was gone, yet their defiance had written a legend. From that moment forward, the Liberty ship would never again be dismissed so lightly. This was the paradox of the Atlantic War. The vessels least expected to endure became the ones that saved Britain from starvation, supplied Soviet armies, and gave the Allies the logistical backbone to launch D-Day. What began as laughter in Berlin and Hamburg, as engineers scoffed at welded seams and mass-produced hulls, would end as a bitter admission. The rust buckets had become lifelines. And this story of irony, endurance, and industrial might was only beginning. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a grinding war of attrition, a contest measured in tons of shipping sunk, barrels of oil delivered, and weeks of food left in British warehouses. By late 1940, the numbers told a chilling story. Germany's U-boats were sending merchant ships to the bottom faster than Britain could build replacements. At the peak of the campaign, in early 1941, losses climbed above 600,000 tons a month. For an island nation utterly dependent on imports, this was not merely a military problem. It was a question of survival. Night after night, convoys in the North Atlantic faced wolf packs of German submarines. Torpedoes streaked through black water, exploding in fireballs that lit the horizon. Sailors clung to rafts in freezing seas, listening to the cries of comrades swallowed by the waves. The silence that followed was broken only by the groan of twisting steel as another freighter slipped beneath the surface. At home, civilians felt the effects just as sharply. Bread lines grew longer, ration books grew thinner, and shelves in London grocers often stood bare. One civilian diarist wrote in despair, We live each day never knowing if the ships will come. The markets are empty, the queues endless. Coal shortages left families shivering through bitter winters, while imported grain dwindled to the point that daily rations dropped to barely sustainable levels. The Royal Navy fought desperately to protect the lifeline. Destroyers and corvettes raced across the Atlantic, their sonar pings echoing into the depths, but the convoys were stretched thin and the escorts too few. By late 1940, Winston Churchill confided to his war cabinet that the Battle of the Atlantic is the only thing that ever really frightened me. For the British Prime Minister, the U-boat menace was more dangerous than the Luftwaffe's Blitz or the looming threat of German invasion. Across the Atlantic, the United States was still officially neutral. Yet President Franklin D. Roosevelt saw the peril clearly. If Britain starved, the last bastion of resistance in Europe would collapse, leaving the world to face Hitler's empire alone. In one of his famous fireside chats, Roosevelt declared that America must become the great arsenal of democracy, producing the weapons and supplies that Britain could no longer live without. But how could this be achieved? Shipyards were slow, skilled labor was scarce, and the complexity of traditional merchant ships meant that construction could not keep pace with destruction. German U-boats could sink a freighter in minutes, but it still took months to replace one. The equation was unsustainable. The solution would come not from naval tradition, but from industrial imagination. American planners proposed a radical idea: to design a single, standardized merchant ship that could be built in massive numbers by ordinary workers, many of whom had never seen a shipyard before. It would not be beautiful, nor fast, nor even expected to last very long. What mattered was speed, the ability to build them faster than the Germans could sink them. This was the seed of the Liberty Ship program. It was born not out of pride, but out of desperation. The Allies needed a vessel that was cheap, simple, and reproducible on an unprecedented scale. Critics dismissed it as folly, a dream of assembly-line ships that would crumble under the strain of the ocean. German officers, already celebrating their dominance, laughed at the notion that such clumsy vessels could change the balance of power. Yet for Britain in 1941, with its lifeline fraying and its cupboards bare, this gamble was the only hope left. The Atlantic had become the Empire's greatest battlefield, and the answer would not come from battleships or cruisers. It would come from the humble merchant ship, reimagined, rebuilt, and reborn on American assembly lines. As Britain's leaders pleaded for relief, Roosevelt's America prepared to act. Factories would be converted, new shipyards carved out of mudflats, and thousands of men and women recruited to an industrial army. The Liberty ship was about to move from blueprint to reality, and with it, the balance of the Atlantic war was about to shift. The crisis of 1941 demanded something radical. Britain's convoys were bleeding, and the United States, still short of time, money, and ships, needed a solution that could be built not in years, but in months. The answer came in the form of a ship that was never meant to be beautiful, the Liberty ship. Its origins lay in Britain. Early in the war, the British merchant shipbuilding mission approached the Americans with a design for a simple, tramp freighter known as the Empire Liberty. It was utilitarian, slow, and stripped of frills, but dependable. American planners took this blueprint and reworked it for speed of construction, substituting riveted plates with welded seams. Welding cut labor time drastically, but it came with risks. Many naval traditionalists scorned the approach, warning that welded hulls could crack under stress. Some even derided the Liberty as a 5-year ship, good enough for wartime needs, but never intended to survive beyond them. What the critics failed to grasp was that longevity was not the point. These vessels were designed to be expendable, built faster than the U-boats could destroy them. The United States Maritime Commission set the audacious target: thousands of ships, produced on an industrial scale. At the heart of this miracle stood industrialist Henry J. Kaiser. A construction magnate with no prior shipbuilding experience, Kaiser revolutionized the process by applying assembly line techniques learned from building dams and highways. His shipyards, carved almost overnight into the mudflats of California and Oregon, pulsed with round-the-clock activity. Unlike the old naval yards of the East Coast, Kaiser welcomed an entirely new workforce: women, African Americans, and immigrants. many of whom had never handled steel before the war. The conditions were intense. Sparks from acetylene torches showered the ground. The clang of steel plates echoed like artillery, and workers endured long shifts in freezing rain or blistering sun. Yet the spirit of urgency bound them together. A female welder later recalled, "We knew every seam we laid was part of something bigger. We were building a lifeline for boys fighting far away." Production numbers soon stunned the world. In 1941, a Liberty ship took about 230 days to complete. By 1943, Kaiser's methods slashed that average to just over 40 days. The most famous feat came in Portland, Oregon, when the SS Robert E. Peary was laid down, assembled, and launched in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. A publicity stunt to showcase America's industrial might, but proof that the process worked. Each Liberty ship displaced 14,245 tons, stretched 441 feet long, and carried over 9,000 tons of cargo. They were powered by a single triple expansion steam engine that gave them a modest top speed of 11 knots, barely fast enough to keep up with convoys. Critics scoffed that they were ungainly, ugly ducklings, but every ton they hauled meant more tanks, aircraft, food, or fuel delivered to the front. German intelligence analysts watched the numbers rise with disbelief. For every U-boat patrol that returned with tonnage sunk, America's shipyards launched replacements in equal or greater measure. A Kriegsmarine officer, captured later in the war, admitted that the flow of these vessels was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. Beyond the statistics lay the human effort. More than 500,000 workers took part in Liberty ship production across 18 shipyards nationwide. Many were women who stepped into roles once denied to them. They became welders, crane operators, and inspectors, immortalized in posters as Rosie the Riveter. Others were African Americans who saw in the shipyards both opportunity and discrimination, segregated work crews, but a chance to earn union wages and contribute to the war. The Liberty ship was not glamorous, nor was it meant to be. It was a blunt instrument of survival, hammered together from steel plates and human determination. Each launch was marked not by grandeur, but by urgency. Every new hull sliding down the ways meant another convoy strengthened, another chance that Britain might endure. By the end of 1942, hundreds of Liberties were already plowing through the Atlantic, their welded seams holding firm despite skeptics' warnings. They were the proof of concept. Ugly, yes, but effective. Their arrival marked a turning point in the struggle at sea, not through firepower or speed, but through relentless industrial will. What began as a desperate gamble had become an unstoppable tide of steel, and soon, these rust buckets would begin to show their true worth, as U-boats discovered that the Allied lifeline was no longer so fragile. By 1942, the Liberty ship had left the slipways and entered the crucible of the Atlantic. Painted in dull gray camouflage, these boxy silhouettes formed the beating heart of Allied convoys. Their holds bulged with grain, fuel, ammunition, and tanks, cargoes without which Britain would collapse and armies overseas would starve. Yet every crossing carried a terrible risk. The Atlantic remained a hunting ground, where Admiral Karl Donit's U-boats prowled in wolf packs, determined to choke the lifeline. The threat was constant. In the darkness of the mid-ocean, torpedo wakes streaked toward unsuspecting ships. Survivors described sudden eruptions that split steel apart, hurling men and cargo into the sea. Flames from ruptured oil tankers painted the waves orange and black, while burning debris drifted among lifeboats. A British merchant sailor later recalled, "When the ship went up, it was like the sun had burst beneath our feet." For the Liberty ship crews, many of them civilian merchant mariners, the dangers were relentless. The SS Jonathan Sturges was torpedoed in 1942 off the coast of South Africa. Though the vessel was lost, its crew endured hours adrift before rescue. Yet what marked the Liberty program was not fragility, but resilience. For every hull destroyed, shipyards launched another to take its place. Germany sought to terrorize the sea lanes, but the tide of steel never stopped. Convoy battles highlighted their indispensable role. During the perilous Arctic run to Murmansk, convoys like PQ-17 carried Liberty ships laden with trucks, aircraft, and raw supplies for the Soviet Union. The The route was among the most dangerous of the war, with U-boats, aircraft, and surface raiders converging in the icy twilight. When PQ-17 scattered under the threat of the battleship Tirpitz in July 1942, dozens of merchantmen were lost. Yet Liberty ships that survived limped into Murmansk, proving the concept. If enough were sent, some would always get through. The Mediterranean saw similar trials. In November 1942, Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa, relied heavily on Liberty ships to deliver tanks, jeeps, aviation fuel, and rations. Without them, the landings could not have been sustained. German submarines and Italian bombers struck at the supply lines, but the Liberty convoys pressed forward. Their sacrifice ensured that the American and British armies had the material to push Rommel's Afrika Korps back across the desert. Statistics told the grim cost. By war's end, 200 Liberty ships had been lost to enemy action, many in the Atlantic's black waters. But their presence multiplied convoy strength. Instead of fragile, underpowered freighters straggling alone, convoys bristled with Liberties moving in columns, each a floating warehouse guarded by corvettes, destroyers, and eventually escort carriers. As Allied radar and air patrols improved, the wolf packs found it harder to break through. What made the Liberty ships remarkable was not their glamour, but their sheer necessity. Their flat decks often carried Sherman tanks lashed down with cables, wings of aircraft folded tight, or mountains of crates bound for distant fronts. Soldiers landing in North Africa, Italy, or Normandy often disembarked directly from a Liberty's gangways. They were the silent partners in every campaign. German commanders, once dismissive, grew increasingly bitter. Reports to Berlin complained that American industry was producing replacements faster than U-boats could sink them. One U-boat officer, captured after his vessel was depth-charged, admitted in interrogation, "We thought they were clumsy beasts. But they came in endless herds, and each one carried death for Germany." The experience of the convoys left deep scars on those who served aboard. Merchant mariners endured not only enemy attack, but cold, hunger, and isolation. Diaries speak of nights when the only sound was the thrum of engines and the knowledge that at any moment, a torpedo might strike. Yet they also recall the sight of Liberty ships on the horizon, their boxy shapes a promise of supplies, reinforcements, and survival. By late 1943, the tide was turning. Allied escorts gained the upper hand, but it was the presence of Liberty ships, dozens in every convoy, that gave the escorts something to protect, something to fight for. They were never sleek or celebrated, but in the crucible of the Atlantic, these vessels proved that mass and determination could blunt even the deadliest of threats. What the Liberty lacked in elegance, it made up for in endurance. And as the convoys continued, it became clear the so-called rust buckets were doing more than carrying cargo. They were carrying the weight of victory itself. By mid-1943, the long night of the Atlantic was finally breaking. For 3 years, German U-boats had haunted the sea lanes, striking at will against merchant convoys that carried the lifeblood of Britain and her allies. But now, the hunters were becoming the hunted. New weapons, new tactics, and above all, new ships began to overwhelm the wolf packs. The change was sudden, dramatic, and irreversible. Technology played its role. Escort carriers brought squadrons of aircraft to the very heart of the ocean, closing the notorious Black Pit, where convoys once had no air cover. Long-range patrol bombers like the B-24 Liberator prowled above, their radar sets cutting through fog and night to reveal U-boats on the surface. Destroyers and corvettes bristled with improved sonar, while new depth charges and forward-throwing Hedgehog mortars made the seas more dangerous for submarines with every passing month. One British escort officer later recalled, "For the first time, we were on the offensive. We could hunt them, not just run from them." Yet it was not technology alone that decided the outcome. It was industry. The Liberty ship became the weapon Germany could not defeat. For every merchant vessel sent to the bottom, American shipyards launched 2 or 3 more. Between 1941 and 1945, more than 2,700 Liberties were built, a number so vast that even Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat arm, admitted the futility of his campaign. In May 1943, later called Black May by the Germans, 41 submarines were destroyed in a single month. Losses on that scale were unsustainable, and the balance of the Atlantic war shifted. The sight of convoy columns stretched across the horizon stunned U-boat crews. Men who had once ridiculed the Liberty as a cheap freighter now spoke with dread of the endless supply lines they faced. A captured German officer confessed in interrogation, "It no longer mattered how many we sank. The Americans built more than we could ever hope to stop." What these vessels carried mattered as much as their sheer numbers. From 1943 onward, Liberty ships brought Sherman tanks to Britain in preparation for the Normandy landings. Others carried aviation fuel to the harbors of southern Italy, feeding the Allied push up the peninsula. Still more braved Arctic seas, hauling ammunition and food to Murmansk for the Soviet Union. In every theater of war, the gray, box-like silhouettes of Liberty ships signaled that the Allies were on the move. For the men aboard them, the work remained perilous. Torpedoes still found their targets, and many Liberties went down with their cargoes. Survivors described desperate nights clinging to rafts, watching convoys sail on without them. But increasingly, such tragedies were isolated. Convoys that had once been massacred now reached their destinations intact, protected by the combined shield of escorts and air power. By the summer of 1943, the U-boat threat was effectively broken. Dönitz, who had once boasted that his submarines would strangle Britain into submission, withdrew his wolf packs from the North Atlantic. The campaign that had seemed so close to victory in 1942 was now collapsing under the weight of Allied production. The Liberty ship, ungainly, plain, and mocked at birth, had become a symbol of inevitability. This turning point was more than a tactical shift. It was the demonstration that industrial might could be as decisive as battlefield courage. The Liberty ships ensured that the Western Allies could stockpile the resources needed for the invasions of Italy, Normandy, and beyond. Each hull that left the slipways was a promise. The promise that the Allies would not run dry of food, fuel, or weapons, no matter how many submarines prowled beneath the waves. The battle for the Atlantic was far from bloodless, but by late 1943 the outcome was no longer in doubt. The tide had turned, and the Liberty ship stood at the very center of that victory. In the early years of the war, no one praised the Liberty ship for its beauty. Sailors, both Allied and enemy, often joked that they were little more than ugly ducklings. With a top speed of just 11 knots, they were slower than many of the U-boats that stalked them. Their slab-sided hulls and bare decks made them appear ungainly compared to sleek liners or warships. Even among the convoys they served, veterans would mutter that a Liberty ship's best defense was being at the back of the column, so the torpedoes hit someone else first. Yet mockery gave way to reliance. These ships were not built for elegance, but for endurance. Again and again, they proved their worth in the harshest conditions. Many survived torpedo strikes, their welded hulls cracking but holding long enough for crews to abandon ship. Some were raised, patched, and sent back to sea within weeks. A British dockworker later recalled, "They were like stubborn mules. Knock them down, and they came back to carry the load again." For the sailors who manned them, respect grew with experience. Diaries tell of men who lost one Liberty ship in the icy North Atlantic, clinging to rafts in seas covered with burning oil, only to find themselves boarding another within days. There was a grim rhythm to it: loss, survival, return to sea. It was a cycle that tested morale, yet it also built a strange resilience. As one American merchant seaman later said, "They weren't pretty, but they brought us home." Germany, too, was forced into a bitter acknowledgement. Admiral Karl Dönitz had once promised that his wolf packs would sever Britain's lifeline. By 1943, he knew the opposite was true. Liberty ships were being launched faster than his U-boats could sink them. The more his men reported success, the more the Allies seemed to multiply their efforts. The vast slipways of Kaiser's shipyards in California and the East Coast turned steel and sweat into an unstoppable tide. This shift carried a psychological weight as well as a strategic one. To Allied civilians in Britain and the Soviet Union, the arrival of a Liberty ship convoy meant survival. Bread on the table, coal for the winter, tanks for the front. For soldiers fighting in North Africa or slogging through the mud of Italy, they meant fuel, ammunition, and letters from home. Slowly, what had been derided as fragile rust buckets came to symbolize hope. For Germany, the laughter faded into grim silence. Captured U-boat crews admitted in interrogation that they no longer believed victory possible. One officer described the convoys as walls of steel that never ended, and another muttered that it was like trying to stop a river with bare hands. The irony was complete. What began as ridicule had become dependence. The Allies could not fight without the Liberty ship, and Germany could not fight against them. By the end of the war, thousands of these plain, unglamorous vessels had carried the weight of empires across the oceans. The sailors who once joked about their slowness now saluted them with respect. The enemy that once sneered at their fragility watched in despair as they became the engine of Allied victory. By 1945, the Liberty ship had become more than a vessel. It was a symbol of endurance, industry, and the quiet heroism of those who built and sailed them. In total, 2,710 Liberty ships were launched, making them the largest single class of ships ever constructed. Each one carried a unique name, often honoring a prominent American figure, yet collectively they became known simply as the Liberties. To the men at sea and the civilians waiting on the docks, they were lifelines. They delivered 2/3 of all cargo shipped from the United States to Allied nations. Grain bound for Britain, tanks and jeeps for North Africa, oil drums for Italy, and aircraft components for the Soviet Union all rode on their decks. Without them, the vast machinery of Allied war, from the D-Day landings in Normandy to the Soviet advance into Eastern Europe, would have ground to a halt. A German officer, reflecting after the war, admitted bitterly that we could sink 10 in a week, but 20 more would arrive the next. The cost, however, was enormous. Merchant mariners faced the same dangers as naval crews, but without the glory of medals or parades. More than 9,000 merchant sailors were lost during the war, many going down in freezing waters lit by burning oil. Survivors recalled nights adrift in lifeboats, watching the silhouettes of Liberty ships vanish beneath the waves, while the convoy pressed on into the darkness. Their sacrifices were essential, yet often overlooked, paid in blood for every ton delivered. After the war, thousands of Liberty ships were quickly sold for scrap, their work seemingly finished. But many endured, refitted for civilian trade, or pressed back into service for later conflicts. In Korea, they carried ammunition and supplies to United Nations forces. In Vietnam, some plied the waters of Southeast Asia, long past their intended lifespan of just 5 years. Others were sold to private companies and sailed under foreign flags, transporting cargo into the 1960s and 1970s. What began as disposable rust buckets became some of the most stubbornly useful vessels of the century. Their legacy extended beyond steel and rivets. The Liberty ship program demonstrated that mass production, once thought suitable only for automobiles or small arms, could be applied to complex war machines. Henry J. Kaiser's shipyards became the blueprint for industrial mobilization, showing how a democracy could outproduce a dictatorship. Welders, riveters, and engineers, many of them women and minorities entering industry for the first time, proved that national will could be measured not just in armies, but in factories. For Germany, the Liberty ship was a bitter lesson in miscalculation. Donitz and his U-boat commanders had believed they could starve Britain into submission. Instead, the endless procession of convoys, bolstered by these humble freighters, turned the Atlantic from a hunting ground into a graveyard for submarines. Historians later agreed, the Liberty ship was not elegant, but it was decisive. It made possible the great amphibious assaults, sustained the Soviet front through Lend-Lease, and ensured that Britain survived its darkest hours. Even in peacetime, the memory of Liberty ships lingered. A handful were preserved as museum ships, monuments to the era of total war. Visitors today can walk their decks, hear the clang of steel beneath their boots, and imagine the cold spray of the Atlantic. They stand not as relics of beauty, but as reminders of utility, sacrifice, and determination. The final image is fitting: a Liberty ship plowing stubbornly through stormy seas, waves crashing against its blunt bow. Once mocked as fragile, it became the vessel that carried victory across oceans. Its story was not one of glamour, but of grit, the triumph of persistence over despair, of industry over blockade, of democracy over tyranny. The Liberty ship's true cargo was not just tanks or food, but hope. And in the darkest years of the Second World War, hope was the most precious commodity of all.